Honestly, I think you're great, don't get me wrong, but you've come in here unprepared in what it costs to launch a product like this in the open world.
Hello, Dragons. My name is Tina Fagihi Hallam.
And my name's Ollie Hallam.
And we're the founders of Flavour Bombs. We're asking for £50,000 for a 10% equity in our business. Having been lucky enough to travel to some wonderful places around the world, I've had the pleasure of eating and recreating some fantastic dishes over the years. However, a lot of them are quite time-consuming to make, and they required a plethora of ingredients that were not always easily accessible. I really wanted to change this, so Flavour Bombs was born.
Each flavour bomb contains all the ingredients needed to help you make an incredible curry, a Vietnamese broth, a sauce, or a Mexican birria consommé, filled with high-quality herbs, spices, garlic, onion, tomato, and more, all perfectly portioned and blended into a delicious globe. As demonstrated, all you need to do is drop one of our flavour bombs into a pan with water, add your protein or veggies of choice, stir, and enjoy. It's like a bath bomb for your saucepan. We launched in February 2024, and the response blew us away. Within weeks, we had interest from a major retailer, an international distributor, and we exploded onto TikTok, with our videos now having over 3.5 million views. Just shy of our first-year anniversary, we hit an incredible milestone of £100,000 in turnover. Now, with your investment, we want to scale and bring flavour bombs to every kitchen, every table, and every heart that beats for the love of food.
Thank you. We would love for you to sample a couple of our flavour bombs. We have birria tacos for you, and also our Guyanese coconut curry.
That's lovely.
In terms of the financials of the business, you started in February 24.
Yeah.
So you've got roughly a year's worth of trading.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can you run me through, you said 100K revenue?
Yeah, so it's actually 105,000 turnover. That was a gross of 56,000 with a net of 30,000.
30,000. Okay, and what are you forecasting for this year?
So 2025, we're actually due to turn over 200,000 with a gross of 105 and a net of 60,000.
Okay.
So 100,000 and going to 200,000. This seems really, really forecasting at a low level. Why has that not gone very well?
I think it was quite conservative because we want to get into retailers, we want to have conversations with them. So we moved into a unit a couple of months ago, but we haven't got our BRC or SALS accreditation yet.
For food hygiene
For food
and
hygiene,
safety.
so that we can go into those big retailers. But we also didn't want to come here and say, we're going to hit 500K next year. We'd be like, well, how? So we haven't forecast fully for what the potential.
The reason why I'm asking is who have you sat in front of? I mean, for example, everybody knows Levi Roots, that's quite one thing, but the opening order that I negotiated just with that, just as a trial, was £170,000.
We haven't had those conversations yet.
Well, you've not sat in front of anyone.
No, we haven't yet.
In the short term,
Yep.
your maximum that you can produce, you would turn over about
200,000.
So what would be your gross profit?
It's about 53%.
How much would you spend on marketing on that?
We're looking for about at least 4 or 5 grand
A month.
A month.
A month, yeah.
So that's about 60 grand a year.
Yeah.
So you've gone from 100 down to 40,
Yeah.
right? And what about your overheads? If you go flat out, you will probably lose 100, 150 grand. Honestly, I think you're great, don't get me wrong, but you've come in here unprepared in what it costs to launch a product like this in the open world. 50 grand won't go far. I think.
No, we won't. But we're not oblivious. Okay, maybe the forecast we put for certain things, we were a little bit naive. But I know, for example, getting a listing is not the hardest part. It's doing the marketing and driving the customers to that retailer. So we do need to have more of a marketing
That costs
push.
money.
How much have you invested in this business?
I mean, literally 300 quid at the start, and then
Yeah.
everything else has been through profits from the business.
Because when Tuka said that you'd come in underprepared, I'd not read you as being underprepared as entrepreneurs. I think you're really careful and cautious. I think you're managing your business so that you're not losing lots of money. Do you want a big business?
We really want a big business. the dream is we want Flavour Bombs to be a household name.
Yeah.
Oh, should we have a Flavour Bombs tonight, you know?
This is, a silence like this is
Gary,
usually
you're scaring me. Pete hasn't said anything in so long.
This has been really interesting for me because it's quite rare in the Den that you meet two entrepreneurs and you sit here and think, no, they're going to do it. But one of the things that I know is really important is that I'm excited by the category. And I stayed in because I'm so excited by you two, and my money would be so safe with you. But I'm not sure if I'm looking for safe. And because I don't have that level of excitement for this, I'm going to say that I'm out.
Thank you.
Tina, Ollie, I've tasted it, and it without doubt it passes the taste test. It's really, really good.
Thank you.
But what got me was when you said you want a big business. It was a great question from Gary. And I think it could be big if you get this right. I also think that, Ollie, I think you can just carry on being a camera guy.
Yeah, well,
Come and work for me, Ollie.
yeah.
I'm being really straight here.
Yeah.
I think your support of Tina is fantastic. You every time we talk, you keep looking to her. You are an incredibly supportive human, and you're almost looking at her in a very proud way. And whenever
You're going to set me off.
whenever we were talking, getting compliments, he's looking to you, Tina. So I'm going to make you an offer, but it does come at a price.
Of course it does.
I will offer you all of the money for a third of the business, so we can have 33 and a third each.
I don't have great experience in this area, but I have raised significant money in my businesses. So I'm going to make you an offer. And I'll offer
Told
you...
myself I would not get emotional.
Don't get emotional yet, you don't know what
It might be happy
You'll be really
tears, it
crying
might
when
be
they make you the
sad
offer. So I will offer you all the money for 20%.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I strongly feel that you've got something. So I'm going to make you an offer. Gary, would you match Peter's offer for half and half? So they get 2 dragons instead of 1?
Yeah, would.
So we'd match Peter's offer. That's 25,000 for 15% each.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your offers. We really appreciate it. And just genuinely thank you for the feedback that you've given too. That's also invaluable. Peter, we were wondering whether there's any wiggle room at all, because 33% is quite high. Would you be willing to come down?
What to?
25%?
Do you know what? I would do 25% on the condition that my share is not getting diluted if you guys go off and
Go raise.
raise some money.
That's,
We can make
that's,
that
that's
work.
reasonable. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, we'd love to accept your offer.
Yeah.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you for your time.
Well done.
you.
Well done.
Thank you so
Well
much.
done.
Thank you.
I love being rejected. It's great.
Very well done. Thank you so much.